This is Ed Murrow, and this is the nuclear submarine George Washington. Beneath each of these hatches will be a 28-foot Polaris missile designed to fly 1,500 miles, eventually 2,500 miles. These hatches normally open at launch depth, the natural habitat of submarines. Since 1945, when man first unleashed the force of the atom and fashioned it into a bomb, he has been faced with the problem of getting it on enemy targets. The only two delivered in anger, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were big, bulky things that weighed thousands of pounds and had to be carried in the bomb bays of B-29. Now, the year of the Polaris, a three-stage missile whose first stage is really a 380-foot submarine that can go around the world on a core of uranium only slightly larger than a golf ball, and which can fire 16 hydrogen warheads without ever surfacing. Admiral Raborn, they do look like the doors of doom, don't they?
Yes, they do. Most awesome. More firepower from the missiles which will be stored here than all the bombs dropped in both sides in World War II combined.
Say again?
The firepower of these 16 missiles, which will be in the air soon, is greater in TNT equivalent than all of the bombs dropped in both sides in World War II. Just one of these submarines.
A long time ago, when we first heard about Polaris privately, we asked the Navy for permission to chronicle its progress, and eventually, if it became successful, to deliver this report. This now is our report on Polaris. It contains not only the success, but some of the disappointment and heartbreak along the way. But above everything else, it is the story of a group of dedicated men who dreamed and sweated and dared and gambled under the waters at Cape Canaveral on July 20, 1960, in a climax unprecedented for a nation at peace.
Exercise head, power on. All instrumentation systems are go.
Weapons launcher, tube number 9 is pressurized.
This is nickname, stand by for a 10-second count. Stand by, stand by, stand by.
Many people have asked about the origin of Polaris. Who was responsible for it? Well, no one man was responsible for it. But it came about in part as a result of a Navy project called Lamplighter. In the early 50s, when the Russians began to develop a huge submarine fleet, the Navy engaged in this Lamplighter exercise designed to examine what use could be made of a submarine fleet capable of launching missiles off our coasts while submerged. As a result of this exercise, they concluded that defense against such weapons was so difficult that we would be well advised to develop that kind of system ourselves. And this is what our story is about. When the Navy first conceived of putting ballistic missiles in a fleet of underwater launching pads, the hope was that the Army's Jupiter missile could be mated with the atomic submarines. The Navy was at that time the stepchild of the Defense Department, which insisted that as long as the Army had a 1,500-mile Jupiter missile, which it wouldn't be permitted to use, the Navy adapt it for use at sea, instead of coming up with a missile specially designed to be fired from a submarine. The Jupiter, shown here, stands more than 60 feet high, is filled with 100,000 pounds of highly volatile liquid oxygen and kerosene that has to be force pumped just prior to launch. Requires a countdown period of anywhere from 15 minutes to 10 hours. And as Admiral Raborn, the chief architect and guiding hand of the Polaris project, soon determined, just wasn't going to work.
Now, the Jupiter is a large liquid fuel missile, and we conducted controlled tests to see if this missile could be used aboard ship, and we were dismayed, actually, with the dangers inherent in large quantities of liquid fuels aboard ship in confined spaces.
Someone told me you decided at one point it would be almost as easy to fire the submarine as the missile. Is that an exaggeration?
Yeah, perhaps a bit.
If the Navy didn't have the right missile to put in the submarine, they at least had a nuclear submarine, thanks to Rear Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, who virtually willed our nuclear submarine fleet into existence. As early as 1956, Rickover said this to us.
In my opinion, the Nautilus is not simply another new submarine that can travel for practically unlimited distances under the water. I consider that she's a new weapon. and that she may have just as profound an effect on naval tactics and strategy as the airplane has had on war.
One of the earliest American efforts to use submarines as launching pads was the Regulus, shown here. This required the submarine to surface, disgorge a cumbersome launching pad, and then fire an air-breathing short-range missile, which was not a rocket at all, but rather an unmanned aircraft. But the Regulus was run down by history with the advent of the Soviet and American advances in ballistic missiles, which soar out of the Earth's atmosphere at speeds of 18,000 miles an hour. The Regulus, the solid fuel Polaris route, was taken in 1955 when the president was recovering from a heart attack, and when Defense Secretary Charles E. Wilson had little enough enthusiasm for rockets, especially rockets designed to be fired from a submarine while submerged. The fight for Polaris was carried out largely by a group of young naval scientists and by Admiral Arleigh Burke, then as now Chief of Naval Operations, then as now a diplomat who remembers that enthusiasm for Polaris was not exactly unanimous. I've been told that you gave Admiral Red Raborn a letter which said, in effect, give this man anything he wants. Is that roughly right?
I gave Admiral Raborn this letter because there was a lot of opposition within the Navy, too. Not opposition, there were a lot of differences of opinion. A lot of people thought this cannot be done. There's too much to do. There are too many things that are undeveloped, too many breakthroughs that we have to have. And so I gave Admiral Raborn this letter and said to other people, give this man what he wants, and we'll restrict him to 50 people, 50 managers, 50 people directly under him. He can choose anybody he wants, but he can't have very many. And that was to keep it small so that each one of those people would be good and would be contributing. I also told him in the same letter that there are many cutoff points on this thing, many things that you have to go, that you have to be able to do. If you reach a stage where you cannot do this thing, we will kill the project.
But two other technological breakthroughs sent the Navy on a completely different course. One, the Atomic Energy Commission invention reducing the size of the hydrogen bomb warhead, making possible a much smaller missile, and the advent of highly powerful solid fuels. The difference between a solid fuel and a liquid fuel is the difference between a bullet or an artillery shell and a jet engine. Solid fuel, as used in rockets, is mixed, kneaded, molded, baked into a rubbery plastic-like substance. But unlike the Jupiter or Atlas, which is an enormous flying fuel tank, the Polaris solid fuel is the engine itself, packed into the missile container. Specifically, the Polaris is two solid fuel bodies flying in tandem, which separate automatically, like this. But as the experiments with solid fuels progressed, there were other problems to be dealt with concurrently, which is a fancy way of saying they had to be solved without ever knowing whether the entire concept would work. There had to be swimming pool tests, further to determine the effect of water, motion, and depth on a bird that would have to live in seawater, the Earth's atmosphere, and the vacuum of space. This is Stanley Burris of Lockheed, Polaris's prime contractor. Well, now the missile comes out as a result of pneumatic pressure, compressed air. When do the engines fire, and how is that determined?
The missile is launched by means of compressed air, which is fed underneath and is released by a trigger-like mechanism that is all at once, and the missile is pushed out much the same as you would push the charge out of a shotgun. Or for that matter, in a more common analogy, it is very much the same as the Navy has been launching torpedoes for a good many years. It is in principle the same thing. It does light at a definite time after what we call first motion of the missile, which is the first movement being pushed by the air.
This missile, unlike other missiles, must be able to operate in water, in atmosphere, and up where there is no atmosphere, right?
That is correct. As a matter of fact, that is one of the more interesting aspects of the design of this thing. It's designed literally for two extreme conditions. One, the high pressure condition of water, water pressure at the operating depths and from there to the surface, and it's designed like any other missile would be for that matter for the extreme heating environment that one reaches at these high supersonic speeds, particularly in the high Q region, which is a way of saying at the lower end of the Earth's atmosphere. When you get out of the atmosphere, of course, this problem goes away in a manner of speaking and only manifests itself again as you get into re-entry problems, about which you've heard plenty by this time, I'm sure.
Yes.
We still have that problem on Polaris, but it's been rather neatly solved, we think.
All right, now let's say the missile comes up at the proper angle. What happens if at the point when it reaches the surface it gets hit by, say, a 40-foot wave?
Well, to use your dimension exactly, a 40-foot wave, he might be in trouble, although I really doubt it. I just say this to be technically correct. The system is designed to withstand the environment of waves that are not much less than 40 feet. That is part of the underwater launch problem. It is part of the missile stability problem, whether one can fire through waves and stand this perturbation on the side or at any angle to it. Generally speaking, high waves do not bother the missile within reasonable limits. I would hate to shoot one through a so-called tidal wave or anything like that, but it's been designed with that in mind.
Well, you don't really guess about these things here, do you? You make waves yourselves, don't you?
Yes, that's a function of this, one of the functions of this facility we're in now. We lower this assembly down into an appropriate depth in the pool, and depending on what the experiment is, we either generate waves or we don't. But we can generate waves of appropriate height on a model basis to simulate the rather horrendous conditions we were discussing a few minutes ago to see how these models behave. In addition to the exit phenomena, of course, we're interested in the underwater behavior, how stable they are, and the effects of cavitation and things of that nature.
What looked feasible in a scale model pool might look different in the ocean. So there were a series of launcher tests. Pea shooter, pop-up, sky catch, and one called fish hook because the missile was tethered. But long before the Navy could know whether the Polaris would really work from underwater, it had to take another calculated risk that it would work at all, so that concurrent to its success, there would be an atomic submarine ready to be its launching site by 1965. In 1957, the Rickover reactor group in the Navy had on the ways at the General Dynamics Electric Boat Works in New London, Connecticut, a 250-foot submarine called the Scorpion, an attack submarine. Boldly, the Navy cut the Scorpion in half and inserted a 128-foot segment, which made room for 16 Polaris launching tubes. And the Scorpion was renamed the George Washington. Simultaneously, the Navy shot the works with another $100 million and converted another attack submarine, then building, into the Patrick Henry for use as a Polaris submarine. The launching system was farmed out to Westinghouse, near San Francisco. Rocket engines to Aerojet at Sacramento. Guidance systems for the bird to General Electric at Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Guidance for the submarine to Sperry on Long Island. And North American Autonetics near Los Angeles. But Polaris got its biggest thrust from a rocket made in Russia. When Defense Secretary Charles Wilson authorized the Polaris program, he said the Navy would have to pay for it out of existing funds, no special appropriation. That meant the Navy had to cut back on other aspects of its program. But then in the autumn of 1957, Sputnik changed all that. Polaris got $350 million of its own and orders to go full speed ahead. And Admiral Raborn revised his timetable and said he'd have a Polaris submarine roaming the ocean by December of 1960. By September 24, 1958, the solid fuel concept seemed on its way. On pad 25A at Cape Canaveral sat a squat 28-foot champagne bottle, which was the Polaris in its first configuration. But when the button was pushed and the bird took off, it failed to program. And the range safety officer exploded it 40,000 feet in the sky. Post-mortem verdict, a malfunction caused by a faulty part. Admiral Raborn read the contractors a lecture. In October, there was another try. But the Polaris AX-2 blew up on its pad. The second stage, blown clear, seemed all right, but had to be destroyed. On the ground, the first stage still belched fire like a Roman candle. Post-mortem verdict, failure of an explosive bolt between stage 1 and stage 2. Cynics began to call Polaris the snake killer. The palmetto bushes near Canaveral are infested with rattlers. By late December of 1958, the Polaris AX-3 was ready. She got off the pad in good style and even achieved a separation of stages. But then, the second stage began to gyrate wildly. This time, the trouble appeared serious. Trouble which the engineers diagnosed as hot bottom. The heat from the burning fuel was causing the tail of the missile to come apart, and the destruct button was pushed. There was another try with Polaris AX-4, which met the same fate. There would have to be a search for new materials. 2 months went by before Polaris AX-5 was on the pad to test another aspect of the bird's performance. It went out of control, and with it went many tempers in the Pentagon. Admiral Raborn was advised to stop testing. Determined to adhere to his schedule, Raborn fixed April 20, 1959 as the firing date for the improved Polaris AX-6. It was an unqualified success. 400 miles down the course. At the Electric Boat Shipyards in New London, they had been under forced draft, too. It was only a year and a half after the welder's torch cut the Scorpion's keel in half that the George Washington slid down the ways, June 9, 1959.
I christened the George Washington. Whoa!
That's a year less than schedule time for building a submarine of her class. There had to be some human engineering also.
One had to design the missile envelope to fit the most optimum design.
Crews which took the Polaris submarine to sea would have to be prepared to remain there for several months at a time. And they'd have to know more about complex gear than any submarine crew before them. The Navy programmed 2 crews, a blue and a gold, for each ship. Began training the George Washington's men at Sunnyvale more than 2 years before they ever saw a Polaris submarine. It's Commander James Osborne, skipper of the George Washington.
We've been involved in a continuous shaking down of this ship for 15 months. 15 months of really the toughest and hardest work, and under the toughest conditions that I've ever asked any of my crews that I've been with through my service in the Navy to work under. Now, let me tell you this, with a man, my service reputation and appreciation for individual excellence, Raborn and Rickover trained, I'm not very easy to please.
Until now, every Polaris fired had been from a stationary traditional launching pad at Cape Canaveral. The next milestone was to lob one up and ignite it in mid-air, and a ship launcher simulator was built for this purpose underground at the Cape. The first attempt was made on August 14, 1959, right on schedule, and was successful. 8 successes followed, with no failures. Next, a ship, the Observation Isle, once intended as a missile launcher itself, was outfitted as a floating laboratory, blockhouse, and launching pad. 6 Polaris were fired from the Observation Island. At the same time, the George Washington was undergoing sea trials and ejecting dummy missiles out of its tubes. It was this operation the Russian trawler Vega, visible in the distance, observed off Long Island. But before a live Polaris could ever be fired from the submarine, it had to be proved that a live hot Polaris could successfully be launched from below the surface and ignite above water. This is San Clemente Island, off the California coast, where on April 14, 1960, a launcher similar to that in the George Washington was towed out into the Pacific, and with the help of cables and skin divers, hauled down to a depth which cannot be revealed, but corresponded to submarine launch position. Inside the launcher was a full-scale Polaris, but loaded with what is called a cut-grain supply of solid fuel, just enough of a charge to lift it 1,800 feet above the water before falling back into the ocean. 20 minutes before firing time, the control barges were cleared of all personnel. And in the blockhouse on San Clemente, the first countdown on a live Polaris underwater launch was begun.
All stations stand by for a mark at minus 120 seconds. Stand by. Mark, minus 120 seconds.
Give me status report, flight control.
Flight control ready.
Guidance.
Guidance ready.
Ignition.
Ignition okay.
TM.
TM 1, 2, and 3, B plus and filament.
Recharge squelch switch off.
Squelch switch off.
All stations stand by for a 95-second count. Stand by.
Despite the complicated checking procedures which precede launch, the missile only becomes a live, poised weapon when this piece of hardware is inserted in the panel socket.
Range, this is a remote firing plug installed. We have a prepared light. This station is now ready for the event.
TM recording.
TM recorder on.
Thank you.
Mark, minus 70 seconds. Stand by for a 65-second count. Stand by.
Okay, let's keep it clean and cool.
63, 62, 61. Mark, minus 1 minute.
The blockhouse is a sealed, protected fortress with no view of the missile before or after launch, other than by electronic instruments and television cameras, above and below water.
Mark, minus 45 seconds. Stand by for a 40-second mark. Stand by. Mark, minus 40 seconds.
Pumps on.
Pumps on.
Thank you.
Stand by for a mark at minus 30 seconds.
Channels complete, Vern.
Calibration's complete.
Thank you. Let's go internal.
Flight control internal.
System status.
TM okay. Guidance okay. Ignition ready.
19,
Fire control ready.
Flight control ready.
16,
You have a green light.
I've got a green board. Here we go.
12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire.
Here again, in slow motion, is the first Polaris in history making its exit from the sea and blasting off while poised in midair. The technical achievement of this feat is dramatized by relating it to an Atlas or a Jupiter liquid fuel launch, where the missile is lined up on its solid platform for many hours, and many corrections are made on the pad for its ultimate line of flight. In contrast, the Polaris, on a tactical mission, leaves the water, sometimes at an unpredictable angle, makes its gyroscopically controlled corrections, and takes off toward the atmosphere and its target. This firing was an important milestone, but this countdown wasn't the only one going on. There also had to be a managerial blockhouse, which coordinated all the breakthroughs involved, all the contractors, and made certain that everything came out at the same time. One man had to be responsible for getting together all of these incredibly complicated pieces of machinery. He had to have his fingertips on every piece to see to it that they all arrived at the right place at the right time and that they fit together properly. You've never heard of this man. He's never had his name in the newspapers. He's a civil service employee, doesn't make very much money. But his contribution was in the field of management, something that is badly needed not only on the Polaris program, but elsewhere in the country. His name is Gordon Pearson. You ought to meet him.
It's like creating an automobile transportation capability, not an automobile, but a total capability, in which we were working not only on the internal combustion engine and the other mechanical features of an automobile, but we were developing a rubber industry that could produce pneumatic tires. We were developing a petroleum industry capable of producing the kind of gasoline that would make these automobiles run. We were building roads, bridges, putting up gasoline stations, and even running driver training courses.
And of course, all this had to be done before anyone knew that the automobile was a feasible proposition, that the wheels would turn or the carburetors function. Isn't that right?
That is right.
Well, as a result of your overriding priority, you've had rather less interference than most similar organizations in Washington, haven't you?
This is true, and it's one of the real advantages that we've had in this program. And it's an advantage not to be minimized. We have been exempt or relieved of some of the attentions of people who, in seeking to prevent small errors, do quite often deny or at least delay big successes. This has been a very real advantage to us. We've adopted here very early in the staffing of our organization the concept that you can get more work out of one man who is overworked than two men who are underworked. They have a tendency to get in one another's way if there is more than absolutely necessary. I think this has been a rather important part of the success of our operations. We've had to keep lean and hard in order to live together and to understand that we were dependent upon one another.
The submarines were going to be ready on schedule. The Polaris missiles were beginning to check out, but they would have to be mated and go to sea together. Those first critical